The auctioneer's gavel had not even finished falling when Perry Walker realized he had just traded the last thing of value he owned for a woman whose eyes held more fire than any flame he had ever seen burning on the open range. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything. The last real settlement before the cattle trails turned wild and the land stopped pretending to be tame. The stockyards smelled of dust and manure and money. The boardwalks were crowded with cowboys fresh off the Kishom Trail, and the saloons never closed because nobody in Caldwell kept hours. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made in a single afternoon and lost before supper, where the law existed more as a suggestion than a guarantee, and where a man like Rufus Clade could stand up on the steps of his own trading post and sell a woman like she was livestock. Perry had ridden into Caldwell that morning with a straightforward purpose. He needed a new saddle. His old one, a well-worn Visalia that had carried him across 4 states and 100 cattle drives, had finally given out 3 days south of town when the tree cracked clean through during a river crossing. He had ridden the last 70 miles bareback on his gray gelding, Smoke, and every joint in his body had reminded him of it with every single step. He had $32 and a sack of dried beef to his name, enough to buy a decent second-hand saddle and maybe a meal before heading back north toward the Lazy K Ranch where he'd signed on for the summer season. He had not planned on an auction. He had not planned on Rufus Clade, and he had absolutely not planned on Louisa Brenner. Perry had been standing outside the trading post, examining a dented but serviceable saddle hung on a post near the hitching rail, when he heard the crowd gathering. He was 26 years old, lean and weathered in the way that outdoor living made a man, with dark hair that curled a little at his neck and brown eyes that had a habit of taking in more than he let on. He was quiet by nature, careful with words the way a man who had spent most of his life riding alone learned to be, and he had no particular interest in whatever spectacle Clade was putting together. But then the crowd parted just enough that he caught a glimpse of the woman standing on the top step of the trading post, and something in his chest went very still. She was tall and straight-backed, and she held herself that way not from composure but from something closer to defiance. Her hair was dark brown, almost black where the morning sun hit it, pinned back but loosening in the Kansas wind, so that strands of it fell across a face that was striking for its combination of beauty and absolute cold fury. She wore a simple calico dress, dusty from travel, and her hands were bound in front of her with a length of rope that was clearly more for the theater of it than for any genuine restraint, because Louisa Brenner did not look like a woman who could be restrained by anything as simple as rope. Perry moved closer without deciding to. Rufus Clade was a broad, florid man in his 50s, with the kind of easy cruelty that came from never having faced any real consequence for it. He had a showman's voice, loud and rolling, and he was working the crowd the way a preacher worked a revival tent, all sweeping gestures and planted laughter from his hired men at the edges of the crowd. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," Clade was saying, spreading his thick arms wide. "This here is a fine and practical opportunity for any man looking to solve the age-old problem of keeping house on the frontier. Miss Louisa Brenner, lately of Abilene, 23 years of age, healthy and strong, knows her way around a cook fire and isn't afraid of hard work. Her late father owed me a debt of $80, a debt that passed to her on his passing and she cannot pay it. So here we are. Now, who'll start me at 20? Perry felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the wind. He had seen a lot of things in his years riding the frontier. He had seen men cheat at cards and lose their lives for it. He had seen the aftermath of raids, both by outlaw gangs and by the army. He had ridden through towns where justice was whatever the richest man said it was. None of it had ever sat easy with him, but he had learned, the way a man had to learn out here, that some things were larger than one person's ability to fix. But this, He watched Louisa Brenner stand on that step and refuse to look afraid, and the crowd started calling out numbers, and something in Perry Walker made a decision that his brain was only half aware of. "I've got the saddle," called a heavy-set man in the front, laughing, "and I'll throw in another 10. 30, said someone else. "That's more like it," Clade said, with a grin that Perry wanted to knock right off his face. Perry looked down at the saddle hanging on the post beside him. It was cracked along the cantle and the stirrups were uneven, but it was serviceable. It might last another season if a man didn't push it. The tag on it read $30, which was almost everything he had in the world. 32, he said, loud enough to carry. The crowd turned to look at him. Clade squinted in his direction. $32, Perry said again. He walked forward, pulling the bills from his vest pocket and holding them up. "That's what I've got. $32 and a busted saddle." There was a ripple of laughter from the crowd, but the laughter had an uncertain edge to it, because Perry Walker did not look like a man making a joke. He looked like a man making a statement. Clade's eyes moved from Perry to the crowd and back, calculating. The bidding had stalled at 30, and whatever else Clade was, he was a businessman. "A busted saddle isn't worth the leather it's cracked on," he said. "Might be worth something as parts," Perry said, his voice even. "Stirrups are good iron. Latigo's barely used. You can get a few dollars out of it." There was a moment, one of those moments that stretches out thin and taut like wire pulled between two fence posts, where everything could have gone any direction. Perry was very aware that he had no backup in this crowd, that Clade's men were watching from the edges, that $32 and a broken saddle was not much of a hand to play. Then Louisa Brenner looked directly at him, not with gratitude, not yet, with assessment. She looked at him the way a person who had learned the hard way to read people looked at someone new, measuring every line of him in the space of a single breath. He looked back at her, steady. "Sold," Clade said finally, with the particular shrug of a man who has decided that a scene isn't worth the trouble. He came down the steps and held out his hand, and Perry crossed the distance and put his $32 into it. And then Clade's man cut the rope from Louis's wrists with a pocket knife. And just like that, in the spring of 1878 in Caldwell, Kansas, Perry Walker owned nothing but the clothes on his back, his horse, and the most complicated situation he had ever gotten himself into. He walked to her as the crowd dispersed, because crowds in Caldwell had short attention spans and there was always something else to look at, and he stopped a few feet away and took off his hat. "My name is Perry Walker," he said. "I know what just happened," she said. Her voice was low and clear and did not waver at all. "And I am not a piece of property." "No," he agreed, "you're not." She looked at him, and the defiance in her eyes shifted slightly, making room for something more complicated. "Then what do you think you just did?" Perry turned his hat in his hands. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I've got a horse and I'm headed north, and if you've got somewhere to be, I'd like to help you get there. No strings on it. You can ride, I'll walk. However you want to do it." She studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the street and a door banged somewhere down the boardwalk, and a horse complained at a hitching rail. "I have an aunt in Wichita," she said finally. "I have not seen her in 3 years. I was on my way there when Clade's men picked me up on the road and brought me here." Perry nodded slowly. "Wichita's about 40 miles northeast, 2 days on horseback, maybe a little more." He paused. "I'm sorry about your father." Something moved across her face, quick and painful and quickly controlled. "Thank you," she said, and the words were quieter than anything else she had said. They stood there for a moment in the middle of the street in Caldwell, Kansas, two people who did not know each other, tied together by $32 and a busted saddle, and the whole situation was so strange and so impossibly large that neither of them seemed to know what to say next. Perry put his hat back on. "Do you need anything before we go? Food, water, anything Clade had of yours that he should give back?" Her jaw tightened. "He has my traveling bag. He took it when his men brought me in." Perry turned and walked back to the trading post, and Louisa watched from the street as he went inside, and 3 minutes later he came back out with a canvas traveling bag that was slightly smaller than it should have been, because Clade had gone through it and kept whatever he thought was worth keeping. Perry's expression when he handed it to her told her that he knew exactly that, even though he didn't say it. "Everything important gone?" he asked. "The money I had left," she said, checking the bag with quick, practiced hands. "My mother's brooch, about $11 and a brooch." Perry stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked back at the trading post. Then he looked at the ground, and Louisa got the strong sense that he was having a very careful internal conversation with himself about what he was and was not going to do in the next 30 seconds. "It's not worth it," she said. "He has men inside." "I know," Perry said. Then he exhaled. "Let's go." He retrieved Smoke from the hitching rail. A lean and well-muscled gray gelding with intelligent eyes and excellent manners, and he helped Louisa up into the saddle with a steadying hand that was careful not to be more than that. He walked alongside her as they moved down the main street of Caldwell, which earned them a few looks from the people they passed, but Perry Walker did not appear to notice or care. Louisa sat on the gray horse and looked down at the top of the man's head as they walked, and she tried to determine what she thought of him. He had spent everything he had on her, which was either the act of a genuinely decent person or the opening move of something she didn't want to think about. He had not touched her with anything other than courtesy. He had tried to get back what Clade had taken from her, which had cost him nothing but some nerve, and he had stopped when she told him to, which cost him more. She had met enough men in enough bad situations to know that the dangerous ones rarely looked dangerous at first. But there was something about Perry Walker that did not read like danger to her. He read like someone who was genuinely uncertain what to do next, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted that uncertainty more than she would have trusted confident ease. They cleared the edge of Caldwell by mid-morning, and the Kansas prairie opened up around them in every direction, vast and gold-green, and indifferent in the way that wild places are always indifferent to the small dramas of human beings passing through them. The sky was enormous overhead, building towers of white cloud in the west, and the grass moved in long, slow waves that made the whole world look like it was breathing. Perry led Smoke at a steady walk, and for the first mile or so neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not entirely comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people trying to decide how to begin. "You said your father owed him money," Perry said eventually, not looking up from the trail. "My father owed everyone money by the time he died," Louisa said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, which was the voice of someone who had processed the grief and the anger and arrived at something harder and cleaner. "He was a good man but a terrible businessman. He ran a dry goods store in Abilene, and he extended credit to everyone who asked for it, and most of them never paid him back. When he died in February, the store was worth less than what he owed. I sold everything I could, paid what I could, and started for Wichita to find my aunt." She paused. "I didn't know Clade had bought my father's note. I didn't even know there was a note. But two of his men found me on the road 2 days out of Abilene and told me I owed Clade $80, and when I told them I didn't have it, they brought me in." Perry was quiet for a moment. "Was it a legitimate debt?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "It might have been. My father borrowed money from a lot of people, but even if it was legitimate, what Clade did with it was not." "No," Perry said. "It wasn't." Another silence, and in this one there was a kind of recognition, the acknowledgement between two people that they have looked at the same thing and understood it the same way. "How did you end up in Caldwell?" Louisa asked. "You said you were headed north." "That's the wrong direction for any of the big ranches." "I work for the Lazy K up near Newton," Perry said. "They winter their cattle south and bring them back north in spring. I was riding ahead to Caldwell to pick up supplies and meet the rest of the drive. I've been doing this for about 4 years now." He paused. "Before that I was working drives up from Texas." "You've been alone a long time," she said. It was an observation, not a question. He glanced up at her and she met his eyes without apology. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk," she said. "You choose every word. People who spend a lot of time with other people get careless with words. You're not careless. Perry considered this, and she had the sense that he was turning it over, genuinely examining it instead of just deflecting. That's probably true, he said after a moment. I don't mind it, the quiet. Neither do I, Louisa said. Usually. They stopped at noon at a creek that cut across the trail, a shallow, clear run of water that flowed cold over flat limestone. Perry watered smoke and filled his canteen and laid out what he had left of his dried beef, which was not much, and Louisa opened her bag and found a heel of bread and a small jar of preserved plums that Clade's men had apparently not thought worth taking. They sat on the creek bank and ate, and it was the first real pause either of them had taken since the morning, and the act of sitting down together and eating, something so ordinary and human, seemed to change the atmosphere between them slightly, warming it. I need to tell you something, Louisa said, breaking a piece of dried beef with more force than it strictly required. All right, Perry said. I am grateful to you, she said. I am genuinely grateful, and I want you to know that. What you did this morning was real, and it mattered. But I also need you to understand that I am not your responsibility. I am not a debt you have now discharged by riding alongside me, and I am not an obligation you have taken on. When we reach Wichita, we part ways as equals, and you go back to your life and I go back to mine. Perry looked at her for a long moment. The creek ran quietly between the stones and smoke grazed a few yards away, and the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction. I understand that, he said. Do you? Yes, he said. You've spent the last God knows how long watching men treat you like a problem to be solved or a thing to be owned, and I walked in this morning and did something that probably looked like more of the same from the outside. Louisa blinked. Yes, she said, and there was a note of surprise in it that she couldn't quite conceal. That is exactly right. I didn't do it to own you, Perry said. He was looking at the creek now, not at her. I did it because I couldn't stand there and watch it happen when I had the means to stop it, that's all. And you're right, we'll part ways in Wichita and you don't owe me a thing. Louisa ate a preserved plum and thought about this. What will you do without a saddle? He exhaled through his nose, and it was almost a laugh. Figure something out, I suppose. There'll be a saddle somewhere. There usually is. You spent everything you had, she said. I had $32 and a cracked saddle, he said. I wasn't exactly wealthy to begin with. She looked at the side of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the careful way he held himself even when he was relaxed, and she thought, this is a man who has had hard things happen to him and has not let them make him hard. She did not know how she knew that yet, but she knew it. Tell me about the drive, she said, and her tone was different now, the careful, formal quality of it easing just slightly. Tell me what it's actually like. Perry turned to her, and something in his expression shifted, opened up. He began to talk, and she discovered that she had been right about him choosing his words carefully, because when he spoke about the drives, about the long silences of the prairie and the way a herd of cattle moved at night like a dark, breathing river, about the particular cold of a February morning in Kansas, and the way the first spring thunderstorm looked coming across flat ground from 20 miles away, he chose the right words every time, words that made pictures. She listened, and the afternoon began to stretch toward evening, and they mounted up again and headed northeast, and the conversation moved from cattle to the dry goods store in Abilene, and from there to her mother, who had died when Louisa was 16, and from there to her father, who had been gentle and impractical and who had loved his daughter with the complete and uncomplicated love that some fathers manage to give, and which she had spent a lot of these past months missing with an ache that had no clean edges. Perry listened with the same quality of attention he gave everything else, and he did not try to fix her grief or improve upon it or redirect it. He just heard it. And that was, Louisa thought, rare enough to be remarkable. They made camp as the sun went down, finding a low rise with a line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge that would break the wind and give them some cover. Perry built a small fire with driftwood and dead grass, the kind of fire that gave heat without much light, which was the practical way to camp on the open prairie where firelight could be seen from a long distance. He had no bedroll to offer her beyond his own, which he insisted she take, and he settled himself against the cottonwood roots with his jacket across his shoulders and his hat over his face, and appeared to fall asleep with the infuriating ease of a man who had been sleeping rough for years. Louisa lay in the bedroll and looked at the stars, which out here with no town light to compete with were extraordinary. A whole universe of them spilled across the dark in layers and depth that she had almost forgotten about during her years in Abilene. She thought about Clade, and about the people in the crowd who had been laughing and bidding, and about the many ways the world had of reminding a woman that it did not think very much of her. She thought about her father's handwriting, the careful looping letters of his account books, and about the brooch that Clade had taken, which had been her mother's and which she could not replace. She thought about her Aunt Clara in Wichita, who had written letters through the years that were warm and practical, and who had said, the last time they had spoken, that there would always be a place at her table. And then, because she could not entirely stop herself, she thought about Perry Walker, who had walked out of a crowd of men and said $32 and a busted saddle, and whose voice, when he talked about the prairie at night, sounded like someone describing something they loved without knowing they were doing it. She fell asleep before she had decided what to think about any of it. Morning came in shades of rose and gold and gray, and Perry was already up when she woke, crouched by a small fire with a battered tin pot of coffee that he had produced from his saddlebag. He handed her a cup without being asked, and it was hot and strong and real, and she drank it standing up and looked east at the sunrise, and for a moment everything was quiet and good. "I've been thinking," she said. Perry waited. "You said you had to meet the rest of your drive," she said. "I've kept you from your work." "The drive won't move without me," he said. "I'm not the trail boss, I'm just a hand, and they know I might be a day or two. Still, it's fine, Louisa." It was the first time he had used her name, and they both seemed to notice it at the same moment. It hung in the morning air between them, not awkward exactly, but weighted. "Louisa," she said, as though hearing it back. "My father always called me Lou. Everyone else called me Miss Brenner. Which do you prefer?" She thought about it. "I'm not sure anyone's asked me that before." "Well, I'm asking." She looked at him, and the sunrise made the prairie around them glow like copper wire, and her dark hair was loose from yesterday, falling around her shoulders in the kind of disarray that a person who cared about appearances would have hurried to fix. She didn't. "Louisa," she said. "My whole name. My mother gave it to me, and I like all of it." "Louisa," he said again, and this time it was just a confirmation, comfortable. They broke camp and headed northeast again, under a sky that was clear and hard and blue in the way that Kansas sky got when it meant to be beautiful. And they rode and talked, and the miles passed, and something was happening between them that neither of them was naming, yet, because the naming of it would have made it real in a way that was complicated by the fact that they had known each other for less than 24 hours, and by the further fact that they were headed to Wichita, where they would part ways as equals. They talked about everything. She asked him where he was from originally, and he told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had been a blacksmith and a mother who had taught school, both of them dead now. His father from a fever in 1869 when Perry was 17, his mother 2 years after that, and how he had headed west because staying felt like standing in a house where the walls had been removed. The structure was gone, but you kept moving around inside it by habit. He had been 20 when he came west, and 21 when he hired onto his first cattle drive, and the work had suited him in a deep and structural way that was about more than money. It was about the kind of solitude that was full rather than empty, the solitude of large things, of sky and grass and distance, which was different from the solitude of grief. Louisa listened to this, and found herself telling him about her own years of keeping her father's books after her mother died, of being 16 and then 17, and then 18, and taking on the administrative weight of the store because her father was brilliant with people and terrible with numbers. Of teaching herself de Balentry bookkeeping from a manual she ordered from Chicago. Of the satisfaction she had found in it in making the numbers balance in the particular beauty of order imposed on chaos, which was what a good set of accounts was when you got right down to it. She had liked that work. She had been good at it. You could do that anywhere, Perry said. Bookkeeping, any business in any town needs it. I know, she said. My aunt has a boarding house. I thought I might help her with the accounts and find other work in the meantime. Wichita's bigger than it used to be. It is, he said. It's a real town now, decent law, some decent businesses. He paused. You'll do well there. She heard something in his voice that was careful and controlled, and she filed it away without examining it yet. They stopped midday at a farmstead to ask about water and fill the canteen, and the farmer's wife, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Havorson, took one look at them and assumed they were married and pressed a wrapped bundle of corn bread and cold chicken into Louisa's arms before they could explain the situation. And both Louisa and Perry thanked her without actually correcting the assumption. And then they were back on the trail with chicken and corn bread and an atmosphere between them that was warm with the accidental fiction of it. She thought we were married, Louisa said. I noticed, Perry said. You didn't correct her. Neither did you. She looked at him and found him looking back at her, and the look lasted a beat longer than it needed to, and then the trail bent north and they followed it. They made camp the second night near a dry creek bed where enough rainwater had collected in a rock hollow to water smoke and refill the canteen. Perry shot a rabbit with the small revolver he carried at his hip, which was a practical rather than a showy weapon, plain and functional, and cleaned and cooked it over the fire. And Louisa found herself watching his hands as he worked, the efficient, competent way they moved. Can I ask you something personal? She said. You can ask me anything, he said. Why haven't you settled somewhere? You're 26. You've been working drives for years. Didn't you ever want a place of your own? Perry was quiet for a moment, turning the rabbit over the fire. I've thought about it, he said. I've got enough saved to put down on a small piece of ground. I've been thinking about it more the last year or so. He paused. What stopped me was never knowing quite where the right place would be. It's a big country. I didn't want to plant myself somewhere just to have somewhere to be planted. What would make a place the right place? She asked. He looked at her across the fire. I've been wondering that myself, he said, and his voice was very level, but his eyes were not level at all, and Louisa felt something warm and frightening and entirely welcome move through her chest. She looked down at her hands. Perry. I know, he said. I know it's only been 2 days. It has only been 2 days. Yes, she looked up. I don't want to be something that happened to you, she said. A situation you got yourself into and then felt obligated to. I told you that on the first day. I know what you told me, he said, and I meant what I said back. You're not an obligation. You're the most interesting person I've talked to in years, and I am aware that I have said more to you in 2 days than I usually say in a month, and that is not nothing. He paused. But you're right that it's 2 days, so I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm just being honest that when you asked me what would make a place the right place, the first thing that came to mind was having someone worth coming home to. Louisa Brenner sat by the fire on the Kansas Prairie in the spring of 1878 and looked at a man she had known for 2 days and felt the particular, terrifying clarity of a heart that is beginning to make up its mind. We should sleep, she said. Yes, he agreed. Neither of them moved for another hour. They talked instead about smaller things, about books and music, and whether Kansas would ever have enough trees, and about the boarding house in Wichita, and about the spring drives, and about all the things that two people talk about when they are skirting the edges of something too large to look at directly but too present to ignore. When she finally did lie down, Perry sat against the cottonwood and listened to the prairie dark and thought about $32 and a busted saddle, and what a strange and specific miracle an ordinary morning could turn out to be. They reached the outskirts of Wichita on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Wichita in 1878 was in the middle of its own complicated transformation. The cattle trade had shifted south and west, as the railroad pushed further into Texas, and the town was reinventing itself from a trail town into a proper settlement, with brick buildings going up on Main Street and a newspaper and a church and a school, all the institutions that turned a camp into a community. It was bigger than Louisa had expected and noisier, and it smelled of the Arkansas River and fresh lumber, and the particular mix of civilization and frontier that she had known all her life. Prairie Road smoked down Douglas Avenue with Louisa riding and he walking alongside, which was still how they had arranged it because he had refused to let her walk and there was only one horse, and she had stopped arguing about it by the second day because arguing with Prairie Walker about his stubbornness was like arguing with the weather. "What street does your aunt live on?" he asked. "Market Street," she said. "The boarding house is called the Brenner House. My aunt kept her husband's name when he died, but the house has been in the family since my grandfather built it." They found it 3 blocks off the main commercial strip, a sturdy 2-story frame building with a wide front porch and window boxes where someone had planted geraniums that were just beginning to bloom red against the white-painted wood. It was the most cheerful-looking building Louisa had seen in weeks, and she felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of it. Before they had even tied Smoke to the porch rail, the front door opened, and a woman came out who was clearly related to Louisa by the way she moved and by the particular set of her chin, though she was older, perhaps 50, with silver in her dark hair and deep lines at the corners of eyes that were currently filling with tears. "Louisa," said Clara Brenner, and opened her arms. And Louisa Brenner, who had been composed and controlled and practically careful for 3 solid days, walked up the porch steps and into her aunt's arms and cried, quietly and briefly, in the way of a person who had been holding themselves together for so long that safety felt like it might undo them. Prairie stood at the base of the porch steps and held Smoke's reins and looked at the geraniums and gave them their moment. Clara wiped her eyes and held Louisa back to look at her and then looked past her to the man standing at the bottom of the steps. "And who is this?" Louisa turned, and there was a complicated expression on her face that Prairie could not quite read. "This is Prairie Walker," she said. "He helped me get here from Caldwell." Clara looked at Prairie with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had run a boarding house for 20 years and therefore had extensive experience reading the character of strangers. "Helped her how?" "It's a long story," Prairie said. "I've got time," Clara said. Louisa told it quickly and without embellishment, and Clara listened with her expression shifting from concern to anger to something more complicated as the story reached its end. When it was done, she looked at Prairie for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. There's dinner on and I suspect you haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days." Prairie started to demur, and Clara cut him off with the authority of a woman who was not accustomed to being argued with in her own house, and so they went inside. The boarding house was warm and smelled of bread and roasting meat, and the kind of everyday comfort that was, after 3 days on the prairie, almost overwhelming. Clara fed them at the kitchen table and asked Prairie pointed questions about his work and his background and his intentions, not rudely, but with the directness of a woman doing her due diligence, and Prairie answered everything honestly, including the part about having no money and no saddle. Clara looked at him when he said this. "You spent everything you had. I had $32, he said, and a saddle that was already broken." Clara looked at Louisa. Louisa looked at the table. Clara made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. After dinner, Louisa walked Prairie out to the front porch while the evening light was still good, and the geraniums were bright red in the last of the sun, and somewhere down the street children were shouting at some game or other, and Wichita in the spring evening was almost peaceful. "You should stay the night," Louisa said. "Aunt Clara has a room. It's late to be riding." "I've got to get back to the drive," Prairie said. "I'm already 3 days behind. They'll be wondering." "One more night won't matter," she said, "and Smoke needs the rest." It was true about the horse, and Prairie knew it, and he also knew that this was not primarily about the horse, and he suspected she knew it too. "All right," he said. They stood on the porch for a moment, and the children down the street went in for supper, and the street was quieter, and Perry turned his hat in his hands the way he did when he was thinking about something he wasn't sure how to say. "I don't want to say goodbye yet," he said. "I know I have to. I know there's a whole cattle drive waiting on me, and you've just arrived somewhere safe, and there's nothing about this situation that makes sense as anything other than what it is, which is two people who met under very strange circumstances and spent 3 days riding together." He paused. "But I mean what I said about wanting to know what makes a place the right place." Louisa leaned against the porch railing and looked at him. "And what have you figured out so far?" "That it has something to do with this conversation," he said simply. She was quiet for a long moment. The evening deepened around them and the first stars appeared above the Kansas rooftops. "I will be here," she said. "At this address, you know where I am." "Yes," he said. "The drive will end in the fall, September, maybe October," she nodded. "Then you have until September to figure out the rest of it." He looked at her and she looked at him, and it was not a promise exactly and it was not a declaration exactly, but it was something real and mutual and carefully chosen, the way everything they had said to each other over the past 3 days had been carefully chosen. "That's more than fair," Perry said. He left the next morning before she woke, which was the practical thing because if she had been awake to say goodbye, he was not sure he would have managed the goodbye cleanly. And he rode Smoke north out of Wichita on a borrowed saddle that Clara had produced from the barn with the air of a woman who had been solving logistical problems since before Perry was born. And the spring prairie spread out around him in every direction. And he rode into it carrying $32 worth of something he didn't have a name for yet, but that felt like the most valuable thing he had ever owned. The cattle drive was long and grueling in the way that cattle drives always were, all dust and early mornings, and the particular tedium of covering the same ground at the pace of the slowest steer. Perry rode with the drive and did his work, which he was good at, and at night when the other hands played cards or argued about nothing, he sat at the edge of the firelight and wrote letters. He had not been much of a letter writer before. He had written to no one in years, having no family left and no particular correspondent, and the act of putting words on paper came to him awkwardly at first, the way any long unused skill does. But he persisted, because Louisa Brenner had listened to him talk for 3 days and shown him that words, his words, were worth something, and he found that the letters came easier as the weeks went on. He wrote about the drive, about the wide stretches of the Flint Hills, and the way the buffalo grass looked in June when it was still green, and about a thunderstorm that had nearly stampeded the whole herd in the hours afterward getting the cattle settled, and about a young cowhand named Ethan who was 16, and on his first drive and reminded Perry uncomfortably of himself at that age, which is to say earnest and frightened, and trying very hard not to show either. He wrote about the towns they passed through, about Newton and Salina, about the way the railroad was changing things, the buffalo gone from the southern ranges now in a loss that Perry found genuinely sad, though he knew it was one small grief among many larger ones for the people whose land and way of life had been taken to make room for the cattle and the towns and the rails. He sent the letters to the boarding house on Market Street in Wichita and hoped for the best. Louisa wrote back. Her first letter came to him in care of a trading post in Newton that he had mentioned in his second letter as a likely stopping place, and the trader, a man named Abernathy who had a sideline in message carrying for the drovers, handed it to him with raised eyebrows and a notable lack of discretion. Perry took it to the edge of the corral and opened it carefully. She wrote the way she talked, which was clearly and precisely, and with the occasional sentence that surprised him with its beauty, the way a plain landscape suddenly shows you a single remarkable thing. She wrote about settling into her aunt's house, about the bedroom with the window that looked east and the way the sunrise came into it in the morning, about the other boarders, a retired surveyor named Mr. Pope who ate his dinner in 15 minutes flat every evening and then retreated immediately to his room, and a schoolteacher named Miss Hartley who was 27 and had opinions about everything and was great company. About beginning to keep Clara's accounts, which were in considerable disarray through no fault of Clara's, who was excellent at running a house and indifferent to columns of figures. About Wichita itself, which was growing fast and needed a bookkeeper badly enough that she had already been approached by 2 different businesses. She wrote about her father's brooch, which she had not recovered and probably never would. And she wrote, at the very end, in a hand that was a little less steady than the rest, "I think about the creek bank on the first afternoon quite often. The preserved plums were very good." Perry read that sentence 3 times. Then he folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and wore it there for a week. They wrote back and forth through June and July, and the letters grew longer, and the things they were willing to put into writing grew less cautious. And somewhere in the middle of a July letter Louisa wrote about what she wanted her life to look like and described, without quite seeming to realize she was describing it. A life that had a garden and good books and work she was proud of, and someone to talk to at the end of the day who was worth talking to. And Perry read it in the shade of a cottonwood somewhere near the Kansas-Nebraska border, and felt his whole chest go warm and clear in the way that certainty feels when it is finally, completely settled. He wrote back. He wrote about the piece of ground he had been saving for, which he had narrowed down in his mind to the Flint Hills country that he had been riding through for 4 springs now, where the grass was good and the water reliable, and the land had not yet been entirely claimed. He wrote about a house he had been thinking about, a house with a wide porch and maybe some window boxes if someone wanted them. He wrote about accounts and bookkeeping being skills that a small ranch needed almost as much as a big business needed them. And then he stopped trying to be subtle about it and wrote, "I am going to come back to Wichita in September, and I am going to ask you something important, and I want you to know that in advance so it isn't a surprise, because you told me on the first day that you didn't want to be a situation I had gotten into, and I want you to understand that what I am going to ask is not about obligation. It is about everything else." He sent the letter and spent 2 weeks wondering if he had said too much or said it wrong, and then her reply came. It said, "I will be waiting." 3 words, but they were 3 exact words, chosen by Louisa Brenner, who chose every word on purpose. And Perry Walker folded that letter and put it on top of the other one in his shirt pocket, and rode through the rest of August with a lightness that made the other hands comment on his mood in the teasing way of men who notice things but don't ask directly. September came in gold and rust, the grass curring on the hills and the mornings going sharp and cold, and the drive finished at a stockyard north of Newton, where the cattle were sold and the hands were paid out and the season was officially done. Perry collected his wages, which amounted to $64 plus the advance he had taken in the spring minus the cost of the borrowed saddle, and came to a total of $78, which was the most money he had ever had at one time and felt like the beginning of something. He bought himself a decent second-hand saddle in Newton, a good one, well-maintained, solid leather with brass hardware, nothing fancy but honest and sound. He settled it on Smoke, with a satisfaction that was more than practical. Then he turned south toward Wichita and rode, without stopping, except to water the horse and sleep 4 hours at a stretch, because the distance between where he was and where he needed to be had become unbearable in the specific and sweet way of a distance that is almost closed. He rode into Wichita on a Thursday afternoon in late September, down Douglas Avenue and then Market Street, and he tied Smoke to the rail in front of the boarding house and stood for a moment in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands. And he was 26 years old and had spent everything he owned once before on something that turned out to be the most worthwhile thing he had ever done, and he was about to do something that felt comparably large. The front door opened before he knocked. Louisa stood in the doorway in a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, with her hair properly done but a strand loose at her temple, and she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he had learned over 3 days and several months of letters, and that he knew meant she was feeling more than she was showing, which with Louisa was always the sign that the thing she was feeling was large. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. "I rode fast," he said. She stepped back to let him in. The boarding house was quiet in the afternoon way, the boarders out or resting, Clara presumably in the kitchen somewhere. Louisa led him to the front parlor, which was a comfortable room with good light and Clara's needlework on the side tables, and a bookcase that had clearly been organized recently. They sat across from each other, and there was a moment of silence that was nothing like the silences they had shared on the prairie, because those silences had been the silences of people with time, and this one was the silence of something that needed to be said. "You said you were going to ask me something important," Louisa said. "I did say that," Prairie agreed, "and you said it wasn't about obligation." "It's not about obligation." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily. Her face was very composed, but her hands were slightly too still, which was her version of nervousness, and he had learned to read her well enough to see it. Prairie leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. "I want to build something," he said. "I have $78 and a good saddle and a horse that will work hard for another 15 years, and I have been looking at land in the Flint Hills, and I think there is a piece of it that is exactly right for a small cattle operation. Not a big ranch, not the Lazy K, but something that's ours. Something that starts honest and grows honest." He paused. "I want to build it with you. I want to ask you to marry me, Louisa, and I want to be very clear that this is not something I am asking because of what happened in Caldwell. I am asking because of every conversation we have had since Caldwell, because of the letters, because of the preserved plums on the creek bank, because you are the most honest and capable and interesting person I have met in my life, and I would very much like to be in the same place as you for more than 3 days at a time." He stopped talking. Louisa was quiet. He waited because he had learned that she thought before she spoke and that the thought was always worth the wait. "You said ours," she said. "I did. Not mine that you would help with." "Ours, equal partners," he said. "You keep the accounts, I run the cattle, we make every decision together." She looked at him for a long time with the measuring look he had first seen on the steps of Clade's trading post in Caldwell, the look that read people down to their bones, and he sat still under it because he had nothing to hide. "Yes," she said. He breathed. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, like she was hearing the word herself for the first time. "I will marry you, Perry Walker." He crossed the room and sat beside her, and she turned toward him, and he took her hands, and for a moment they simply sat like that, holding on to something they had been building toward since a morning in Caldwell when a gavel came down and $32 changed everything. He wanted to kiss her, and she could see him wanting to, and she leaned forward and kissed him first, which was entirely consistent with everything he knew about her. It was a quiet kiss, not tentative, the kiss of two people who have made up their minds, and when it was done they were both sitting slightly closer together than they had been, which felt correct. "Clara is going to say she knew," Louisa said. "She probably did," Perry said. From the direction of the kitchen came a sound that was very possibly Louisa Brenner laughing to herself. They were married in November of that same year, 1878, in a small service at the Methodist Church on Lawrence Street in Wichita. Clara had arranged it with her characteristic efficiency, which meant that despite the small scale everything was exactly right. The church clean and lit with candles against the November gray outside. A handful of guests, including Miss Hartley from the boarding house and the retired surveyor Mr. Pope, who wore his best coat and was clearly moved, despite his general air of being unmovable. The young cowhand Ethan from the drive showed up looking scrubbed and nervous because Perry had written to invite him, and sat in the back row with his hat in his lap. Louisa wore a dress that Clara had helped her make, deep blue wool with white buttons at the wrist, and her hair was up properly for the occasion with small white flowers that Clara had preserved from a late fall cutting. She walked up the aisle on Clara's arm, because there was no father to give her away, and she had decided that this was fine, that being given away was not the metaphor she wanted for this particular day, and so Clara walked beside her as witness and friend. Perry stood at the front of the church in a new shirt and his cleaned and brushed coat and his good boots, and when he saw her come through the door his expression did the thing that Louisa had come to love about his face, the thing where everything he was thinking was briefly, completely visible before he pulled it back into composure, and what she saw in that brief moment was an openness and a gladness so complete it was almost fierce. She reached him. He took her hand. The minister was efficient and kind, and they made their vows in the flickering candlelight with the November wind pressing against the church windows. And when it was done and they were married and turned to face the small congregation, Ethan in the back row was clapping the hardest. His young face split in a grin that Perry thought he would remember for the rest of his life. After the ceremony, Clara had organized a dinner at the boarding house, a real dinner, roast chicken and sweet potatoes and fresh bread, and a cake that Miss Hartley had baked and decorated with surprising skill. And they sat around the long table in the dining room and ate and talked and laughed. And Perry noticed that Louisa was laughing in a way that was different from how she had laughed on the trail. Less careful, more willing to be loud about it. And he filed this away as evidence of exactly the kind of change that 3 months at her aunt's house and a November wedding could make. They spent 2 nights at the boarding house before heading out to look at the land Perry had identified in the Flint Hills, because $78 minus the cost of a wedding license, and a new dress was still enough to put down on a small claim and have something left over. And time in the Flint Hills was better spent in the spring, but Perry wanted Louisa to see it first, to see what he had been describing in the letters. So they rode out together on a cold November morning with Smoke carrying Perry and a hired horse carrying Louisa. And the Flint Hills in November were copper and gold, and brown under a sky the color of iron, and the grass was cured to a warm hay color, and the rocky crests of the hills were stark against the sky, and the whole landscape was severe and beautiful and entirely itself. "This is what you wrote about," Louisa said, looking out from the crest of a long ridge. "Yes," Perry said. "You didn't oversell it," she said. They found the piece he had been looking at, 120 acres in a shallow valley with a creek that ran reliable and a line of hackberry trees along the west side, and a gentle south-facing slope that was perfect for a small house, and they stood on the hillside above it in the November cold and looked down at their future. "There," Louisa said, pointing to the level ground near the creek. "The house there, with the porch facing east." "East catches the morning sun," Perry agreed, "and south of the house, kitchen garden. You need the slope to drain well, and the cattle wintering pasture on the north end, sheltered by those trees." They stood there planning it, this thing they were going to build, and the cold wind came down from the north and they leaned slightly toward each other without noticing, and Smoke dropped his head and pulled at the cured grass, entirely unbothered by the human enormity of what was happening around him. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was spent at Clara's boarding house, which Clara refused to let them feel bad about, declaring that having them there was useful to her, and that she would be poorly served by having her niece sleeping in a tent on frozen ground when there was a perfectly good room available. Perry used the time to make arrangements on the land, filing the claim and beginning the first small structure, a tack shed that would serve as temporary shelter when they moved out in spring, and Louisa threw herself into the bookkeeping with a focus that had already brought her 2 other clients in Wichita, a hardware store and a doctor's practice, and the money she made through the winter went directly into their building fund. Perry watched her work, late in the evenings at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread around her, and the lamp turned up high, her pen moving in quick, clean columns, and he brought her coffee without being asked and sat across from her with a piece of tack to mend or a plan to think through. And the quiet domesticity of it was so entirely what he had wanted, for so much longer than he had admitted to himself, that it still sometimes stopped him for a moment with something like gratitude. Clara saw this because Clara saw everything. She sat with Perry one evening in February while Louisa was delivering accounts to the hardware store and said, very simply, "She's been alone in hard ways for a long time. Keep doing what you're doing." "What am I doing?" Perry asked. "Making her feel like she belongs somewhere," Clara said, and went back to her needlework. March came and the prairie began its slow transformation, the grass putting out the first green threads at the base of the cured stalks, and they loaded a wagon with what they had accumulated and said goodbye to Clara, with the kind of goodbye that is not sad because it is not permanent, and drove out to the Flint Hills and began. The first year was hard in the honest and expected way of first years. The house went up slowly because Perry was also managing the first small herd, 23 cattle purchased with borrowed money from a Wichita bank, and with 2 solid years of good performance to show the banker. Louisa kept the cattle records and the accounts and grew a kitchen garden that outperformed every expectation and learned to ride properly, not just as a passenger, and developed opinions about horses that were, Perry found, entirely correct. There were bad weeks when the weather was wrong and the cattle were sickly, and the money was tight, and the house was still just 2 rooms with a shared wall and a roof that needed work. There were arguments, the real kind that happened between 2 people building something from scratch and therefore disagreeing about nearly every decision, arguments about the pasture rotation and the roofing timber and the price of a milk cow and how much to spend on a second horse. They argued the way they did everything else, directly and without much drama, and reached conclusions that were nearly always better than either of their individual starting positions, because they were building with each other's best thinking, not against it. There were also good weeks of particular clarity and beauty. The week in June when the Flint Hills grass reached its midsummer height, and the whole valley was green and wild-looking, and the cattle were fat and content, and Perry stood at the edge of the east pasture at sunrise and felt the specific satisfaction of a person looking at something they built from nothing and finding it good. The evening in August when Louisa came in from the kitchen garden with her hands dirty and a smear of soil on her cheek, and an expression of complete triumph because the sweet corn had come in, and it was better than anything they had grown the year before. The long October nights when the work was done, and they sat on the porch that was finally finished, watching the Flint Hills stars that were even better than the Wichita stars, and talked about everything and nothing in the unhurried way of people who know they have time. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. They named him James for Perry's father, and he arrived in April with considerable opinion and the dark hair of the Brenner side, and the whole event, which took place with a midwife from the nearest town in Clara, who had ridden out 3 days early because she knew Louisa and she was not about to miss this, transformed everything and nothing. The essential nature of who they were and what they had built remained itself, but now it was larger, warmer, louder in the specific key of a healthy infant. And Perry held his son on the first evening and looked at Louisa over the baby's head and could not find a single word for what he felt, which was fine because she was looking at him the same way and apparently feeling the same thing, and they did not need words for it. Clara stayed 3 weeks, which was exactly the right amount of time, and when she left she looked back at the house from the wagon seat, the 2-room house with the new porch and the window boxes that now had geraniums in them, red against the white-painted wood that Perry had whitewashed the previous fall, and her face did the thing that faces do when they are looking at something they love very much and they are glad. The years built on each other in the way of good years, which is to say they accumulated like layers, each one visible in the life it had shaped. James learned to walk across the kitchen floor and then across the yard and then across the pasture, a decisive child who had his father's way of observing the world carefully before committing to an opinion. Louisa's bookkeeping business, which she ran by mail from the Flint Hills ranch, had grown to 8 clients by 1881 and 12 by 1882, which meant they could afford a 3rd hired hand, and the roof repairs that had been pending for a season. Perry bought the adjacent 80 acres when the claim came available in 1882, which gave them better summer pasture and a second water source, and the herd grew from 23 to 61, and the 61 were healthy and well managed and profitable. In the fall of 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Margaret, and she arrived in October in the same room where James had arrived, and she had Perry's brown eyes and her mother's absolute determination of will, which became apparent almost immediately and never changed. James was 2.5 and approached his new sister with the cautious scientific interest he brought to all new phenomena, and within a week had appointed himself her primary guardian and protector, which was touching and also, in the particular way of toddler protection, occasionally alarming. Louisa nursed the baby and ran her accounts and taught James his letters with a worn alphabet primer, and Perry ran the cattle and worked the land and expanded the house that winter, adding 2 more rooms on the north end so that everyone had more space. And on Christmas morning of 1882, the house was finished enough to celebrate in. All 4 rooms lit with lamp light, and the smell of the pine bough Clara had sent from Wichita in a careful package. And the family sat around the kitchen table and ate and were together. The question of Rufus Clade came up only once in these years, in the spring of 1881. Perry had ridden into Newton for supplies and heard from a passing drover that Clade's trading post in Caldwell had burned in the winter, origin unknown, and that Clade had left Caldwell and was said to be somewhere in Texas. Perry relayed this to Louisa that evening without particular emphasis, and she listened and was quiet for a moment. "I still think about my mother's brooch," she said. "I know," he said. "But I don't think about Clade very much anymore," she said. "I thought I would, but I don't. He took some things from me, but he didn't take anything that mattered the most." She looked at Perry. "You took care of that part." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held on. By 1883, their reputation in the Flint Hills County was established in the particular way of people who do what they say they will do and who treat the people they deal with decently. Perry served a term on the County Road Commission, which he had not sought and did not enjoy, but did conscientiously, because that was how he approached obligations. Louisa became, informally, the person that other settler women came to when they needed to understand the financial documents they were signing, which she discovered was more often than anyone talked about. And she sat at her kitchen table with a succession of women who had been handed papers they couldn't entirely parse, and went through the documents line by line. And what she did was not remarkable in any technical sense, but in a practical sense made real differences in real lives, and she knew it. Young Ethan, who had been 16 on the first drive with Perry, wrote in 1882 to say he had signed on with a ranch in Colorado and was doing well, and was engaged to be married to the daughter of a horse breeder near Pueblo. And Perry wrote back with the satisfaction of someone whose investment in a young person's future had returned a good result. He and Louisa sent a wedding gift and received in return a letter from Ethan's new wife, a practical-sounding woman named Frances, that made both of them like her immediately. The spring of 1884 was when Perry finally told Louisa the thing he had been thinking about since the first year on the land. They were on the porch in the early evening, which was their invariable custom when the weather allowed, the 2 of them in the wooden chairs he had made the previous winter, with the valley below them turning from gold to copper in the last light, and James, now 4, asleep inside, and Margaret, 18 months, asleep in her cradle by the kitchen stove. "I want to tell you something," Perry said. She turned from the view to look at him. She still had the quality of waiting for him to find his words, the quality that had been there since the first day, and it still felt, as it always felt, like being given exactly the space he needed. "The whole ride home from Caldwell," he said, "the ride from Caldwell to Wichita that first time, I spent the entire time trying to figure out how to deserve you." She looked at him, and he could see that she was thinking about the phrasing. "That's a strange thing to say to a person," she said. "I know, but it's what I was doing. You had just been through something terrible, and you were holding yourself together with both hands and making it clear that you didn't need rescuing. And I kept thinking, this person is worth more than whatever I am right now, and I need to figure out how to be the kind of person who has the right to be sitting next to her." Louisa was quiet for a long time. The last light moved across the valley, and she said, "And I don't think you deserve someone. I don't think that's how it works," he said. "I think you find someone who is trying, same as you're trying, and you build something together, and the building is what makes it real." He paused. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm still trying, that I haven't stopped, that every day I'm trying to be worth the trust you put in me." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at the valley, and the silence was not a blank silence but a full one, the kind that contains too much to say directly. "Perry," she said quietly. "Yes. You are the place I was trying to get to," she said. "Even when I didn't know it, even before Caldwell, you are what was waiting at the end of the road I had been on." She reached over without looking at him and took his hand. "You didn't spend the ride home figuring out how to deserve me. You spent it becoming someone I could trust completely. And that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." He looked at their joined hands on the arm of the chair. He was 31 years old and had 140 acres in the Flint Hills and 2 sleeping children, and a woman beside him, whose estimation of him he valued more than anything else in the world. And he had learned in these years something that he had not known at 26, which was that love was not a thing that happened and then was finished, but a thing that was made daily in the choosing and the trying. And that the choosing was the easiest part of it because he would choose her without hesitation in any life he could imagine, but the trying was what made the choosing mean something real. "I love you," he said. He said it simply, the way he said everything without ornamentation. "I love you," she said back. "I have loved you since the creek bank on the first afternoon, though I spent considerable time trying not to admit it because you were a stranger and I had just been through a frightening thing and I had very sensibly decided not to fall in love with the first decent man I encountered. But you did anyway." "I did anyway," she agreed. "You were very persistent in being decent. It wore me down." He laughed and she laughed, and the valley was dark now and the stars were coming out above the Flint Hills, and from inside the house came the small sound of Margaret waking from her evening sleep, ready to make her presence known to the world. Louisa stood and stretched. "Your daughter," she said. "She's yours when she's content and mine when she's loud," he said. "That's not what we agreed," she said, and went inside. And he could hear her voice through the open door, warm and easy, talking to the baby the way she talked to everyone she loved, directly and without condescension and with complete attention. Perry sat on the porch in the dark and listened to his family inside the house and the prairie around him, and the particular quiet of the Flint Hills at night, which was not silence but was composed of so many small sounds that it became its own kind of music, wind and grass and insects, and the low sound of cattle settled in the pasture, and above all of it, the stars that went on forever. The summer of 1885 arrived green and good. James was 5 and following Perry everywhere with the single-minded devotion of a small person who has identified a role model and committed entirely, which meant he appeared at the barn each morning in his small boots and was underfoot in the pasture and asked questions without apparent end, particularly about horses. Perry answered all of them, because his son's questions were always the right questions, precise and curious, and answering them well felt like part of the building he had come to understand was never finished. Margaret, at 3, was an entirely different sort of person, fierce and funny, and possessed of definite views about the order of things, which she communicated with great clarity despite not always having the words for it yet, so that she invented her own words and expected the household to learn them. She called Perry Pa Bear, for reasons that remained obscure, and called Louisa Mama Lou, which Louisa loved and which had come to seem to Perry like the most right name in the world for the woman she was. The whole name, the whole person, contained in 2 syllables. Clara came every summer and stayed a month, and the children climbed on her and made her tell stories, and she obliged them lavishly, because she was constitutionally incapable of resisting children who wanted stories. She and Louisa sat together in the evenings and talked in the low, comfortable way of women who have known each other long enough and well enough to say the true things without preamble. And Perry made himself scarce during these talks, because he understood that some conversations needed their own space. He found Clara alone one August evening on the porch after Louisa had gone in to put the children to bed, and they sat together for a moment in the comfortable way that 5 years of family had made possible. "She's happy," Clara said. "She's really happy. You can see the difference from the first time I saw her when she came up those steps from Caldwell." "I know," Perry said. "She was so careful then," Clara said. "So contained. She had had to be that way for a long time. And she still is in some ways, but she's not contained with you. You can see she's not." "No," he agreed. "She's not. What she told me about Caldwell," Clara said and paused. "I was frightened for her hearing it after the fact. I kept thinking about how it could have gone." "I try not to think about that too much," Perry said. "But here you are instead," Clara said, "because of $32 and a busted saddle." "And preserved plums," Perry said. Clara looked at him. "Preserved plums. It's a long story," he said. She looked like she was going to press the point, and then she decided against it and looked back at the valley and the stars and said, "I'm glad you were in Caldwell that morning, Perry Walker." "So am I," he said, "every single day." The year 1886 brought a hard winter, the hardest the Flint Hills had seen in a decade. The kind of winter that the old-timers called a blue norther in the colloquial way that the era had for naming terrible things. The cold came in October and stayed, and the snows piled up in the valleys, and the cattle lost weight and required supplemental feeding, and 2 of the 60 herd died despite Perry's best efforts. And the fuel for the stove had to be rationed carefully, and there were weeks when the house felt very small, and the world outside felt very large and very cold. But they had built the house well, and they had laid in supplies in September as a precaution, and the children were healthy, and on the worst nights, Perry banked the fire high and they put both children in the big bed, and the 4 of them slept warm while the wind drove snow against the eastern windows. And what Louisa thought about on those nights was the creek bank in Kansas in April 1878. The warmth of the sun and the taste of preserved plums, and a man choosing his words carefully as the afternoon lengthened. The winter broke in March, which was late, and the spring was the kind that follows a brutal winter, extravagant and insistent and beautiful beyond reason, the grass coming up green and deep, and the creek running full, and the cattle moving into the new pasture, with the visible relief of animals who have survived something and know it. Perry and James, now 6, walked the entire perimeter of the property that first warm day, checking the fences that the winter had worked on, and James talked without stop the entire way, which was about 3 miles, and Perry listened and answered and thought about his father, the blacksmith in Missouri, and whether his father would have liked James, and thought the answer was yes, obviously, because James was impossible not to like. When they came back to the house, Louisa was in the kitchen garden turning soil for the spring planting, and Margaret was sitting on the garden edge pulling up small rocks and examining each one with the solemn focus she brought to all geological investigations. Louisa looked up when they came through the gate, and the sun was on her face and her hands were dirty, and she was 31 years old, and had been beautiful to Perry since the morning he first saw her on the steps of Clade's trading post. But she was more beautiful now than she had been then, not despite the years, but because of them, because what he saw in her face now was not just the face he had first known, but everything that had accumulated in it. Every year and every argument and every evening on the porch and every night of a hard winter and every morning of a good spring. The fences are in decent shape, he reported. The garden is going to be better than last year, she said. Pa Bear, look, Margaret said, holding up a particularly significant rock. That's a good one, Perry told her, with complete seriousness. He helped Louisa with the garden that afternoon, which he was not as good at as she was, but gardening was one of the things that benefited from two pairs of hands, and they worked side by side in the spring warmth, and the children played nearby, and the year was beginning and everything was alive. In the summer of 1887, Louisa told him she was expecting again. He received the news the way he received all important things, with stillness, and then with joy that was all the warmer for the stillness preceding it. He held her in the kitchen doorway in the August evening, while the children were in the yard, and said nothing at all for a full minute, which was what she had come to understand was his most complete form of expression, and she laughed quietly into his shoulder. Their second son was born in February of 1888, and they named him Robert, for no particular reason other than that it was a good solid name that neither of them had any complicated feelings about, and he came into the world determined and well-fed looking, and with Perry's dark curling hair. And James, who was 8 by now, took one look at him, and announced that he needed to learn to ride as soon as possible, which was not the most practical timeline, but was the kind of ambition that Perry found he could entirely respect. 3 children in a 4-room house on 140 acres in the Flint Hills of Kansas in the winter of 1888 was a full life by any standard, which meant noisy and complex and richly, densely inhabited in the way that a house with children in it is different from any other kind of house, full of the constant evidence of small people living hard and making things, and losing things and growing. Perry built 2 more rooms in the spring, which they had been planning since the previous year, so that each child eventually had a space of their own, and the house was solid and good, and had been built and added to, and improved so gradually that it had a coherence to it that brand-new houses sometimes lacked, the coherence of something that had grown organically from a beginning and retained the shape of everything that had gone into it. Clara visited in the summers and wrote through the winters, and was the fixed point of family that Louisa needed, the continuity of blood and history that anchored a person in who they had come from while they built who they were becoming. Perry treated her like the family she was, because she was, and he liked her genuinely, which made the family visits easy in the way that visits are easy when everyone in the room actually wants to be there. He wrote to Ethan in Colorado occasionally, and the letters went back and forth with the comfortable irregularity of adult friendships that are real but not dependent on constant contact. Ethan had 2 children of his own by 1888, a boy and a girl, and was running a successful horse breeding operation with his wife Frances, and the letters between them had the particular warmth of men who had known each other young, and had each watched the other become who they were always going to be. The fall of 1889 was the 10th year of the Walker Ranch in the Flint Hills, which they did not formally mark but both of them noticed. The land was productive, and the cattle operation, now 82 head, was sound and respected in the county. Louisa's bookkeeping clients numbered 16, and she had trained a young woman in Newton named Adelaide in the fundamentals, so that Adelaide could handle the local clients and Louisa could focus on the larger accounts that required more complex management. She was, by any objective measure, running a small but genuine business. On a September evening, the 10th September on their land, Perry came in from the evening check of the cattle and found the house quiet, the children fed and James doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table and Margaret reading by the window with the particular absorption of a 9-year-old encountering a book that has caught her completely, and Robert, 18 months, already asleep in the new room they had made for him. The supper things were cleared. The lamp was low. Louisa was on the porch. He got a cup of coffee and went out and sat beside her, and the Flint Hills were the same copper and gold that they had been the first November he brought her here. The first November after the wedding, when they stood on the hillside and planned the house, and he said east-facing porch and she said kitchen garden on the south slope. "I was thinking today," she said. "About what?" "About Caldwell," she said. "I think about it less and less, which is probably good. But sometimes I think about it and I realize that if any one thing had been different, all of this would not exist." She gestured, a gesture that included the house and the valley and the listening prairie and everything it contained. "If you had left for Newton that morning before Clade started the auction, if I had been brought in on a different day, if you had not had $32, if your father's saddle hadn't cracked in that river crossing," Perry said, "I might have had enough for a new one and not needed to look at the second-hand one outside Clade's post. I would have been further down the street." She turned to look at him. "Your saddle cracking is why you were standing there." "I'd been bareback for 3 days," he said. "I was looking at every saddle I could see." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her retracing the logic of it, the small chain of accidents that had built this improbable life. "A cracked saddle tree," she said. "A cracked saddle tree," he agreed. She shook her head slowly, and then she laughed, the good full laugh that had become his favorite sound in the world, the laugh that she gave freely and without calculation now, the laugh that was the evidence of a person who was home. "I am glad," she said, "about everything that cracked and failed and went wrong up to that morning, because all of it led to that morning." He reached over and she was already reaching toward him, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built, with 3 children sleeping and waking inside it, and the Flint Hills stars coming out one by one above the valley, and the grass moving in the last warm wind of September, and behind them and around them and forward into every year they could imagine, the whole vast accumulation of a life made together, made honestly, made from nothing but time and effort, and the kind of love that does not announce itself in declarations, but lives in small choices made daily, in the careful choosing of words and the giving of space and the building of trust over years, until it becomes as solid and structural as the house itself, load-bearing and permanent and entirely itself. Perry Walker held his wife's hand on the porch of their home in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and thought about a morning in 1878 when he had been 26 and poor and bareback, and had walked into the worst kind of moment and done the only thing that seemed possible, and thought, every single dollar was worth it. Every cracked saddle and empty pocket and borrowed horse and difficult year and cold winter and hard choice, all of it had been worth this. Louisa leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had been doing for 10 years, the particular comfortable weight of a person who has decided exactly where they belong, and the stars came out above Kansas, and the autumn grass moved on the hills, and the house was warm with the light of it, and the sound of it and the life inside it, and everything was settled and right and truly, completely theirs.